Personality, Lecture 2. Basic questions we'll be addressing in this video lecture. What is the psychodynamic perspective on personality? What is the humanistic perspective on personality? So we'll start with the psychodynamic perspective. That's Sigmund Freud, the famous Viennese psychiatrist. Freud started out studying medicine in college and then ultimately became the famous psychiatrist that we all know and love, Sigmund Freud. So Freud had his own theory of psychotherapy, which most people are familiar, known as psychoanalysis, but he also had a theory of personality, which most people are unfamiliar with. At least we're familiar with certain parts of it, but many people don't know Freud for having a theory of personality. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So we'll begin with the idea that Freud parsed consciousness into 3 different levels. That is, there's part of us that's awake and aware of internal and external stimuli, so that's the conscious division of our personality. Then there's the preconscious, that's the stuff that's below the level of immediate awareness, but that we can readily bring into our conscious awareness if we put a little effort into it. For example, I'm not thinking of broccoli right now until I refer myself to broccoli, and then I can bring that up out of my preconscious. Or if I ask you to attend to the feeling of your feet on the floor while you're listening to this video lecture, that perception wasn't in your mind or in your awareness in advance of me, probably wasn't in your awareness in advance of me asking you to attend to that, and then you can readily bring that into your conscious awareness if I ask you to. So that's stuff that's in the preconscious, pretty easily to make conscious. And then there's the stuff in the unconscious, and that's really where the action is according to Freud. So we're going to look at 3 components of personality that are kind of battling it out according to Freud, primarily at the level of the unconscious. And basically the outcome of these battles between the id, the superego, and the ego sort of shapes personality. So the id is that part of your personality that is demanding of immediate gratification. So you can think of it as the infantile part of you that says, I want it, I need it, I want it now, and operates without any sort of foresight, anticipation of the consequences of its actions and that sort of thing. So it's a baby within you. And then the superego is kind of the opposite of the id. It's that part of your personality that demands moral perfection and is constantly trying to keep the id part of you in check. And then the ego has the unsavory position of mediating between the id and the superego. So the id, or the ego, is aware of the needs of the id. It's aware of the needs of the superego, and it tries to negotiate. So that's the part of you that's pretty much awake and aware, and trying to create a balance between demands for immediate gratification and sort of the moral imperatives of the superego. So Freud and his ideas can be located in this iceberg model. So at the tip of the iceberg, you have what is in your immediate awareness. That's what you're conscious of. So the ego, there's which directly translates into the I in German. That's the I that you know, the you that you know, all the beliefs about yourself, how you think about yourself, how you feel about yourself and others, and so forth. So it's the part of you that's sort of awake and aware. And the ego, according to Freud, operates according to what's called the reality principle. So the ego is aware of social norms and expectations of others and rules and that sort of thing. And it engages in what Freud calls secondary process thinking. And this is the rational part of you, the part that is able to anticipate the consequences of your actions and to use judgment and higher order cognitive processes in getting along in the world. So the ego functions both at the level of the conscious, that's the you that you're aware of, the world that you're aware of, and then there's parts of you that are below the level of immediate awareness, that is in the preconscious, but that can be readily brought into your conscious mind. And then we have the superego that sort of spans across the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. So there's part of you that is aware of the moral imperatives, that is the decision-making process that you employ when you're trying to decide what's right and what's wrong. that you're aware of. And then there's some of that that's below the level of immediate awareness in the preconscious. And then there's certain moral imperatives that shape your behavior and your thoughts and your feelings that Freud would suggest that you're completely unaware of. That is, these beliefs about right or wrong and motives and that sort of thing to do right or in some cases to do wrong that are residing in the unconscious mind. And then the ego, or excuse me, the id, according to Freud, was completely unconscious. The id operates according to what Freud called the pleasure principle, and this is that infantile part of you that seeks immediate gratification of your needs, oriented towards seeking maximizing pleasure and minimizing punishment. And then the id operates according to the primary process thinking, and really this is quite the opposite of secondary process thinking. Primary process is basically instinctive, reflexive, absent of rational, higher order cognitive processes. Immediate, I guess, response to immediate circumstances and that sort of thing. So this is the iceberg model, and it sort of locates the id, the ego, and the superego across the different levels of consciousness. So for Freud, really the action is at the level of the unconscious mind, and this struggle between the id, the superego, and the ego, trying to sort out all of their various demands. So according to Freud, this constant battle that was going on primarily at the level of the unconscious mind creates anxiety. That is, there's the conflict between the id and the superego, and the ego is trying to sort everything out and live up to society's expectations and that sort of thing. So this creates a certain amount of anxiety, particularly when we might have certain wishes and desires and motives that we might feel that are unsavory, that might, if we acknowledge these feelings and thoughts and motives, that we might be violating some social norms. And so Freud created these defense mechanisms that basically are in place to defend against these largely unconscious motives and instincts, but some of them of which we are quite aware of, that is, motives to aggress, sexual motives, and that sort of thing. So we'll just go quickly through these defense mechanisms. Keep in mind that the relation between these defense mechanisms and personality is that once we develop a pattern that manifests these defense mechanisms, then they become entrenched parts of our personality. They become sort of characteristic ways of behaving. So we'll just go through these quickly. The first one is repression, and Freud characterized that as motivated forgetting. That is, for example, we might have experienced some trauma in our past, and it's too anxiety producing to acknowledge that we experienced this trauma. And for Freud, much of the trauma that kids experience that shaped his thinking and his theorizing was perhaps some physical, sexual abuse early on in life. So we're motivated to forget these things because it's too anxiety producing to face the reality of having had this sort of trauma. So we repress, we block things out. It's a bit different than denial. That's the second defense mechanism. So I don't have a drinking problem. So this is denying the possibility that we have an issue that probably would be better faced head on, but it's too anxiety producing to face this head on. So we deny that this is part of us. We divest ourselves from that part of who we are. Displacement, taking it out on others. This is when somebody might have feelings of anger, for example, towards their boss, and the consequences of actually expressing anger or frustration towards your boss means that you're going to have a conflict or you might lose your job. So you take that energy and you take it out on the ones that you love sometimes. So you come home and you yell at your kids or your roommate instead of taking that anger and in an adult way sorting it out with the actual target of your anger. Projection, that's playing the blame game. That's my example here. So you might know people like this that are unable to really look at themselves critically and accept maybe their shortcomings and then try to remedy them. But instead, they see fault in everybody else that's around them, and they sort of take their own stuff and project it onto others. So, for example, suppose somebody's a procrastinator, they're always putting things off until the last minute. It's affecting their ability to do well in school. And yet they are unable to acknowledge that they are a procrastinator, but they're the first ones to criticize somebody else for being a procrastinator. So we take the stuff that we should be owning and we put it onto others because it's too anxiety producing for us to acknowledge that perhaps we might have some shortcomings. Rationalization, I would have done better if only. So this is coming up with very good reasons for our shortcomings. Again, I'll use the example of somebody who's procrastinating. That is, they might recognize that they weren't able to deliver whatever it is that they were supposed to deliver on time, but yet they have all these very, very good reasons for failing to do so. Regression, stop acting like such a baby. This is when, for example, we might experience frustration and we learned early on that if we throw a temper tantrum that maybe people will give in and give us what we want. So this is essentially going back to an earlier period, developmental period in our lives and employing those kind of strategies that worked for us back then. Basically going back and using infantile ways to deal with current issues. Reaction formation, I can't wait to see you. So reaction formation is behaving in a way that is really completely opposite of the way you actually feel. So for example, I'll use the mother-in-law example. So let's say that a person absolutely cannot stand their mother-in-law and their spouse or partner announces, oh yeah, my mom's going to be coming and staying with us for 6 months. So instead of directly dealing with the feelings of discomfort and loathing, rather the person behaves in a way that's exactly the opposite of how they're actually feeling. And then they're protecting themselves against these magnificent feelings of loathing and dread by behaving in a completely opposite way. And therefore, they don't have to acknowledge their discomfort. Identification. I want to be just like my dad. So identification has to do with basically taking on the characteristics of some powerful other. So we become, in part, who we are, our personalities, because we identify with our powerful parents, or we attempt to incorporate the characteristics of powerful others, like celebrities and so forth, into our own behavioral repertoire, because if we do, we're going to have access to power and prestige and property and all the good stuff like these powerful others have. So identification really explains why people want to belong to high status professions and clubs and that sort of thing, because they want to, in some cases, indirectly have access to power and so forth that these others have. We become like the other to enhance ourselves, in other words, or to protect ourselves against our own feelings of inadequacy. Sublimation. He volunteers for everything. So this is somebody that might have some unsavory or what they consider to be unsavory impulses to aggress or have sex and that sort of thing with others. And it's so uncomfortable to acknowledge these feelings that they take that energy and put it into, for example, doing good. That is, they might think that they're a bad person. And this could be either a conscious feeling or something that's pretty much buried in the unconscious. And then that energy has to go someplace. So it goes into volunteering and doing a lot of good things and that sort of thing because they cannot face the uncomfortable feelings that they have that are buried deep in their unconscious. All right, so these are some of Freud's defense mechanisms. And again, how do they relate to personality? Well, if these different defense mechanisms are employed quite regularly, then basically it becomes a way of being in the world, becomes part of our personality, part of who we are. So you might know some people that reliably execute some of these defense mechanisms. All right, so here's the concept check. Name that defense mechanism. Dad has a bad day at work, comes home and kicks the dog. So that's taking it out on the ones that you love. That's displacement. Here's another one. Jack's favorite team loses in a big game, and so Jack throws a temper tantrum. Regression, going back to that earlier stage in life where maybe temper tantrums worked. Jill, who never seems to be able to develop long-term intimate relationships, blames her recent breakup with Jack on his fear of intimacy. This is projection, so maybe Jill needs to take a long, hard look at her own self. Maybe she's the one with the fear of intimacy, and she cannot acknowledge that, so she projects that onto her partner. All right, so those are some of the defense mechanisms. Moving on. So think about how you would respond to these statements. Think rarely, sometimes, or often. 1, it's hard for me to quickly adapt to change, such as a new job, friend, or neighborhood. 2, it bugs me when my surroundings are not neat and orderly. 3, when on vacation, I need to plan everything and get very upset if things don't go exactly as I'd planned. So if you responded often to all 3 of these, and this is unscientific, by the way, then you might be characterized as being an anal retentive kind of person. You might know people like this that can't tolerate any sort of disorder, and they get very upset if you touch their things and that sort of thing. So Freud would say maybe this person is fixated at the anal stage of development. And this is one of those terms that we can attribute to Freud and Freud's psychosexual stages of development. So Freud had his own developmental theory that has implications for adult personality. And we're going to talk about that next. So this psychosexual stages of development starts with the libido, and Freud characterized libido as sexual energy. So think of this libidinous energy as what makes you go, what energizes you, what drives you forward in the world. So we're all we all seek to satisfy these sexual urges. So for Freud, that life energy was sexual energy. And we seek to satisfy these urges, these libidinous urges, and the way that we satisfy these libidinous urges is different depending on what stage of development we are, how old we are, essentially. So the extent to which these urges are satisfied or unsatisfied has implications for personality, which we'll discuss in a minute. So let's just take a quick look at Freud's psychosexual stages of development. So the first stage is the oral stage. That's going on 0 to 2 years. So here's where kids are getting satisfaction through putting things in their mouth. So their libidinous urges are gratified if they're allowed to, for example, breastfeed sufficiently according to their needs. The anal stage is 2 to 3. So here's where kids are learning to go to the potty by themselves. And this is a big developmental step, because in advance of this, there were no expectations for them really to do much of anything. So now they're being expected to go to the bathroom by themselves, and they become quite interested in their feces at times. If you've ever been around little kids, they're quite delighted with their product at times. And kids, according to Freud, derived a certain amount of pleasure through defecation. So here is the satisfaction of the libidinous urges, the sexual energy is now focused on the anus. The phallic stage 3 to 7. Here's kids realizing that there's difference between boys and girls and men and women, and they recognize that their genitalia are different. And according to Freud, something happens during this stage that involves, for little boys, having sexually tinged feelings towards their opposite sex parents. So little boys want to have sex with their mothers, so to speak. And Freud termed this the phallic stage of development, and or the Oedipal complex, excuse me. So this Oedipal complex involves little boys wanting to be close or wanting to have to be intimate with their mothers, and there's a problem with this, and the problem is that their fathers already have their mothers, so this creates in boys a tremendous state of anxiety, and Freud called this anxiety castration anxiety. So little boys fear that they will be found out by their fathers, and their fathers will castrate them. And so the successful resolution of this Oedipal complex is that little boys will identify with their fathers. This is where identification comes in. And they will begin to emulate their fathers, and they will become like their fathers. And this is satisfying because now the only way that they can get to their mother is by becoming like their fathers. So, at least in part, little boys become like their dads because they've identified with their dads so that they can have access to their mothers. And Freud said that something similar was going on for little girls too, and this was known as the Electra complex. Same sort of deal, that little girls develop feelings for their fathers, and they resolve these feelings and the anxiety that accompanies them by becoming like their mothers. The latency stage at 7 to 11, things kind of go dormant, and then the final stage is the genital stage, where sort of this sexual interest reawakens, reemerges in adolescence and on into adulthood. And Freud suggested that sort of the successful outcome of all this is healthy heterosexual relationships. And Freud had a position on homosexuality, but it's sort of beyond the scope of this class. We're just kind of sticking to the text. All right, so these are the psychosexual stages of development that, according to Freud, people pass through or get hung up on. So this is the relation between psychosexual stages and personality. So according to Freud, we can become fixated at any of these stages. So what fixation means is that we received either excessive gratification or frustration at one of these stages. So, for example, somebody who's fixated at the oral stage might have been allowed to breastfeed. Some kids are voracious breastfeeders and will do it as long as their mothers will permit. So, according to Freud, maybe this is excessive gratification of that libidinous urge that's at the oral stage. So, people who are fixated at the oral stage haven't been able to sort of move past that, and they're constantly putting things in their mouths and that sort of thing. So somebody who's a chain smoker, one cigarette after the other, might be characterized as being fixated at the oral stage. And then somebody who is fixated at the anal stage, that's the anal retentive individual. Perhaps they had particularly harsh toilet training. That is, some parents, instead of punishing their kids for delighting in their bowel movements, might join them in the joy of their creation, and but yet carefully guide them into appropriately using the toilet. Whereas other parents might come down really hard on their kids and punish them and so forth. Excessively harsh toilet training. So these kids might become fixated at the anal stage and become very rigid and that sort of thing. All right, so those are the psychosexual stages of development that have implications for our adult personality. So here's the game. Name that psychosexual stage. Your roommate is a neat freak who gets irate if you leave anything on the floor of your dorm. She may be fixated at the blank psychosexual stage of development. That would be the anal stage. Jimmy experiences sexually tinged feelings for his mother. However, he's concerned that his father will discover him. In order to have his mother, he becomes like his father. That's identification. That's the phallic stage of psychosexual development. All right. So let's take a little time to review psychodynamic perspectives. And Freud is perennially in intropsych textbooks. He was a tremendously influential character in the history of psychology and psychiatry, and his ideas have spread far beyond the realms of psychology and psychiatry, and pretty much has penetrated every discipline, from literary criticism to biology. Also, his terms have entered our popular discourse. I believe that probably just about everybody has heard of the anal retentive type of individuals. So and so is anal. So that comes from Freud. So his ideas have been very, very influential and pervasive. So we continue to learn about Freud in introductory classes like this. So the pros, Freud gave us insights regarding the unconscious. That is, to Freud, much of the action going on between these different components of our personality, the id, the ego, and the superego, and the conflict that is produced and the anxiety that's produced and things we do to manage that anxiety and how that manifests in our personalities, that came from Freud. Role of internal conflict, things clashing together and creating this stress and internal conflict, largely unconscious. We can attribute that to Freud, and then the importance of early childhood experiences. So the good Freudian will always try to root whatever's going on for somebody today in their developmental history. Cons, poor testability. So some of Freud's ideas were really not testable in the traditional scientific sense. So it's really hard to know, for example, when or if somebody becomes fixated at the anal stage and how that relates directly to their later development. Many of Freud's ideas were derived from his work with really what were upper class Viennese women in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So is it really appropriate to generalize and coming up with these broad, grand theories of human behavior based on a relatively small and pretty specific group of individuals, and to propose these ideas and to bank on them essentially as explanatory without actually doing the science. And then sexism, there's been feminist critiques of Freud. Books have been written from the feminist perspective, criticizing Freud, and really he's a target of criticism because his ideas were incredibly influential, and they shaped how we thought about ourselves and other people. So some have accused Freud of being sexist. For example, Freud came up with this notion of penis envy, and this is happening at that phallic stage of development where little girls recognize that their genitalia are different from little boys, and they see little boys' penises and they want one. So technically, it's not the actual genitalia that they desire. Probably it's the access to power and prestige and that sort of thing that little boys and men seem to have. And you've got to remember that this was back in Victorian Europe, where there was a lot of, a pretty clear division between the sexes, and possibilities for women and for men were quite different. Little boys could run around and get dirty and exert themselves and be energetic and that sort of thing, and little girls had to stay inside and help their mothers clean. And so we've got to locate Freud's ideas in sort of the social and historical time in which they emerged. So from a presentist perspective, certainly somebody can argue that Freud's ideas were sexist, but back then it was sort of par for the course, this sort of thinking. All right, so moving on to the next section that we're going to be talking about, the humanist revolt. So we're going to be talking about humanistic psychology, which really reflected a sea change or the emergence of a different perspective in the history of psychology. The humanistic perspective emerged, um, in part because many who were doing work in psychology and psychiatry, even biology, um, found the Freudian or psychodynamic theories, as well as the behaviorist theories, were quite unappealing. Both went beyond their data, for example, and this meant that certainly Skinner was making broad claims about general laws of behavior that he and learning that he had identified it with rats and pigeons, and inferring that unproblematically uh, his findings generalized to the human case. Same thing with Freud. Freud certainly had all kinds of interesting ideas, but he really didn't do the rigorous science that was needed to uh, provide evidence. So they went beyond their data. They were making statements, broad claims that hadn't really been borne out by the science, or haven't even been tested at all because they were essentially untestable. Freud's theories derived from troubled individuals, and I mentioned this before that most of Freud's ideas were derived from his work with upper middle class or upper class Viennese women suffering from what they referred to back then as neuroses. So again, how much can we really know about humanity from this pretty rarefied population? Behaviorists could not explain why learning occurs even when rewards are not offered. So again, you have these grand theorists like Skinner proposing that everything under the sun about human behavior can be explained in terms of response tendencies acquired through conditioning. But really, is that all we are? Or are there certain behaviors, certain things that we do that really can't be explained through reinforcement or punishment? And one of these uh, behaviors is the acquisition of learning. So there was this huge debate between um, people that would suggest, like Noam Chomsky, who's a quite famous thinker from MIT, that suggested that there's some large degree of genetic inputs going into the acquisition of language, whereas the behaviorists would claim that it's simply learned through our experience in the environment. So um, essentially, the argument is that there's things that we do that emerge seemingly in the absence of reinforcement, like language and learning how to walk and that sort of thing. So there's something that drives us forward in the world to gain efficacy over our world, over our environment, that can't be explained by the behaviorists, can't be explained by the Freudians. Overemphasis on animal research. So most of Skinner's studies were done on rats and pigeons. So can we really generalize again to the human case based on these animal models? And the answer is probably not. And then the last, charges that both were deterministic and hence dehumanizing. And this is an important one. According to Freud, our adult personalities were pretty much established by age 5. That is, whatever happened in our lives in advance of age 5 set into motion a pattern of behaving and thinking and feeling that we carry with us throughout our life. And much of that, what's driving those thoughts and feelings and behaviors is below the level of our immediate awareness. It's happening at the level of the unconscious. So really, if we buy into that and we think about our behaviors and our thoughts and our feelings, we can say that I'm really not aware, or I can't be aware of what's driving this. I don't know who I am, because much of what's driving who I am is functioning or is arising from the unconscious mind. So we're being driven by these unconscious forces that we cannot be aware of, or are only dimly aware of. And then the behaviors are saying that much of our behavior and thoughts and so forth, even about ourselves, our very sense of our self-concept, this collection of beliefs that we have about ourselves, has been derived through our experiences in the environment. That is, personality comes from outside of us, not inside of us. And we are who we are essentially because of response tendencies acquired through reinforcement. So on the one hand, we're saying we're being driven by these unconscious forces from within, and the behaviorists are saying that we're being determined from these contingencies, rewards and punishments. So where does that leave the human person? where does that leave us in the sense that we have free will and that we can choose to become who we will, or as an act of will? So arise the humanistic movement. So the humanists focused on the unique qualities of humans. That is what makes us different from animals. We're different. One of these unique qualities is this idea that we have free will and that we can change and grow. We're not bound to our unconscious. We're not bound to environmental stimuli and rewards and punishments, sort of reacting. But we can, as an act of will, grow as individuals. We can self-reflect and we can change and grow. All right, so the humanistic perspectives, two people that you should know something about are Carl Rogers, who developed what he referred to as person-centered theory, and then Abraham Maslow, the gentleman on the lower image, self-actualization theory. So we'll look at both of these perspectives now. So Carl Rogers, person-centered theory. So for the Rogerian or the humanistic psychologists, this idea that our self-concept matters was really key. That is, how you think about yourself, this collection of beliefs or this constellation of beliefs that you have about yourself, was really central to our being in the world. So how we think and how we feel about ourselves matters, whereas this wasn't important at all to the behaviorists. For example, Rogers came up with this idea that there's a self-definition that we have, a self-concept that we have of ourselves, and this is the real self. That is my self-assessment, what I think and feel about myself, the person that I am. And then there's the ideal self. This is the person that I would like to be. So ideally, there would be some overlap, some substantial overlap between our real and ideal selves. So this is congruence, according to Rogers. So this is when the distance between who I am or who I think I am and who I'd like to be is not so far. That is, my real self meshes pretty well with my ideal self. And again, some incongruence or some disconnect between who I am or who I think I am and who I'd like to be is going to be present. But overall, there's a congruence between my self-concept and my ideal self. And then there's incongruence where the gap is substantially wider. That is, there's a disconnect between who I think I am and who I ideally like to be, my actual experience in the world. So the healthy personality, according to Rogers, he referred to these individuals as fully functioning people. So the hallmark of being a fully functioning person is this congruent self-concept. That is, there's a good fit between who I am and who I think I'd like to be. And where there is some distance, for example, I might not be as good of a public speaker as I'd like to be. And I can acknowledge that. I don't have to deny it, that I'm not the best public speaker, but rather I can say, okay, what can I do to improve this aspect of my behavior? How can I improve myself as a public speaker? So they're not rigidly locked into like I'm this terrible public speaker, or an inconsistency might be that I think of myself as being a really good public speaker, but actually I'm pretty terrible. So fully functioning people don't have these sort of disconnects, and they're able to change and grow. Non-fully functioning people deny and distort their experiences to fit their self-concepts. So this is problematic because if somebody believes themselves to be a particular kind of person and they're actually not, this disconnect, the distance between who I am and who I think I am or who I'd like to be, the greater that distance, the more discomfort the individual is going to experience. So according to Rogers, um, congruence is good, and what fosters that congruence is what he called unconditional positive regard. And what unconditional positive regard is having been adequately parented such that who you are as a person and who you'd like to be are pretty close together. For example, some parents delight in their kids' presence. That is, they encourage the child to pursue their own interests and to pay attention to their own motivations. And they're not trying constantly to get the child to live up to their expectations and making their love and affection and care and concern for their child contingent on the child's living up to their expectations. This is unconditional positive regard, that a parent delights in a child simply because they are. And the opposite of that is conditional positive regard. That is, when a parent might make their love and affection and care and concern contingent on the child living up to their expectations. So Rogers, in his particular brand of psychotherapy, which we won't get to until later, really attempted to create a climate in which there was this unconditional positive regard. That is, if I know that I'm okay just the way I am, and I can stop trying to live up to the expectations of others, if I can stop feeling the disconnect between who I am and who I would ideally like to be, this incongruence, to become more congruent, then that would foster the development of a healthier personality. All right, Abraham Maslow, our second humanist, developed what he referred to as self-actualization theory. And Maslow is famous for this quote: "What a man can be, he must be," and I'd like to say a woman as well. But this was back in the 40s and the 50s where Maslow was doing most of his thinking, the 60s as well, and into the 70s. Maslow believed that there's some sort of intrinsic motivation that exists within us all that drives us forward in the world to seek mastery, to become all we can be, maximize our human potential. So to Maslow, there were two types of needs that needed to be satisfied. One were the basic needs. These are needs that satisfy our need for food and water and sleep, to satisfy these basic physiological needs, biological needs. And then there's the meta needs, which is the psychological needs. These go beyond the basic needs, but rather have to do with our needs for self-esteem and other things. And so we'll look at this hierarchy of needs, because these basic needs, once fulfilled, can open the door or lead to our ability to satisfy our psychological needs. So we'll look at this hierarchy of needs. So it's in a pyramid shape. Down here at the bottom, you have as a foundation these physiological needs: hunger, thirst, so forth. So to advance up the pyramid, these more basic needs would have had to have been met. So we have the physiological needs, and we have the safety and security needs. So basically, in this model, these needs have to be met before we can begin to sort of work on getting our other needs met. And then those other needs include belongingness and love, the need for affiliation and acceptance, needs for esteem, gaining some recognition and status in the world, cognitive needs, needs for knowledge and understanding to make sense of our world and our place into it, and then aesthetic needs, the needs for order and beauty. This is once we've had our more basic needs met, then we can begin to think about art and philosophy and that sort of thing. And then the last one here is the need for self-actualization, and here's sort of the epitome of the healthy personality. That is somebody who's been able to satisfy all these other needs. You've reached the pinnacle here where our human potential is realized. This is the need for self-actualization. So again, the lower needs would have needed to be met before advancing up and satisfying the higher order needs. So let's look at self-actualization. So this is the peak or the pinnacle of development, the healthy personality. So this is the highest of all needs and requires the other needs to be met before it can be realized. So according to Maslow, this is the epitome of the healthy personality. And there is some interesting research that Maslow did on these healthy individuals. So in the history of psychology, much theorizing has been done and much thinking has been done through work with people who were disordered. So, for example, Freud developed a lot of his theories working with individuals that were struggling in life. Well, Maslow focused his research on looking at people who were doing extraordinarily well. And he really wanted to find out what makes these people tick. And so he came up with, he identified these people who were self-actualized and he captured their characteristics. So I've included just a few of these, a small list of some of the characteristics of these self-actualizers. So self-actualized individuals experience this acceptance of self, of others, and of nature, the greater freshness of appreciation and richness of emotional reaction, increased autonomy and resistance to conformity, so they're somewhat individualistic, increased spontaneity and creativity, higher frequency of peak experiences. So these peak experiences, when you looked at these self-actualized individuals, they reported having these experiences more often than those who weren't self-actualized of um, having experiences where they felt a great sense of satisfaction and sort of transcendence of themselves. For example, individuals might determine that they want to climb a mountain, so they climb the mountain, and then they have the experience of accomplishment and deep satisfaction, deep connection with themselves and with others and with nature. And so they sort of transcend themselves. And there's certain experiences that you can have that you come out of that experience somehow fundamentally changed by it. And these are peak experiences. So these self-actualized individuals reported having more of those kind of experiences. So that most of us function on a lower level than that of self-actualization. Maslow called the psychopathology of normality, which is very few people have achieved self-actualization and are able to realize their human potential simply because we get hung up in some cases at the lower level. So, for example, it's very hard to imagine somebody sort of realizing their human potential if they're struggling every day to find food, to find water, to find shelter, and that sort of thing. It's really hard to sort of advance up the pyramid scheme and become all you can be if your energy is being spent just simply surviving. So looking at these humanistic perspectives, the pros, the importance of subjective reality, and all that means is that this idea of how we think about ourselves, our self-concept, what we think, what we feel, matters to the humanistic psychologists. It didn't really matter to the behaviorists. They didn't really care how you thought about yourself. But rather, since personality came from the environment, from outside of the self, that's really where the action was for the behaviorists. For the humanistics, it was quite psychologists. It was quite a different story. How we think and feel about ourselves matters. This idea of the self-concept, and you could think of the self-concept as how you answer the question, "Who am I?" So you might develop a list of uh, different descriptors, and that's really this constellation of beliefs that you have about yourself. And really, again, what you think about yourself and what you feel about yourself matters to the humanistic psychologists. And literally, there's thousands of studies on the self. It's probably one of the most studied constructs in psychology, the self. And then the humanistic psychologists laid the foundation for what is now known as positive psychology, which is a really rapidly growing area within this broad discipline. And positive psychologists like Maslow look at those factors, whether they're personality factors or other kind of factors that underpin health, that is both physical and mental health. What is it about these individuals that are doing extraordinarily well in the world that explains this? This is positive psychology. Cons, difficult to test. So again, like Freud, um, some of these ideas were difficult to really put to a rigorous scientific test. So for example, you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Really, how can we know with certainty that if somebody doesn't get their biological needs met or their needs for safety and security, that they can't self-actualize? It's really hard to do an experiment on that using people. It would be unethical and it'd be practically impossible to do that. Certainly people can make observations, but really you can't do a controlled experiment on that. Overly optimistic. This is one of the criticisms of the humanistic perspectives, that this idea that there's this intrinsic motivation to become all that we can be, to maximize our human potential, that people are basically good. Uh, this has been criticized for being overly optimistic, that is imputing some sort of basic characteristics of goodness, and that we're driven to sort of gain efficacy over our world, that we have this drive within us. Um, Maybe we don't. Freud, for example, was pretty pessimistic about human nature, and that most of what drives us in the world is based on this libidinous energy, this sexual energy that we're sort of motivated to gratify, and also needs to aggress. And life really is about, personality is about keeping these unsavory instincts, these basic instincts in check, which is kind of a dim view of human nature. And then again, more experimental research is needed. So really, if you want to make these statements and really buy into them, state them as being the truth of us, you have to do the science. All right, so here's a whole collection of learning objectives. Know that there will be quiz and exam questions based on these learning objectives.